Hello everyone and welcome back. Ever wondered how to build your own ChatGPT app that not only looks slick but also it lets you chat with your local large language model? Well, you're in the right place because in today's video we're going to guide you through the process of creating a ChatGPT app using Streamlit, and we'll even make it resemble the OpenAI chat website. So buckle up and let's dive into it. By the end of this video, you will be able to create a platform or a user interface that pretty much has the same structure as the OpenAI's chat website. So you'll be using Streamlit to kind of actualize that user interface. And also you'll be able to call your local large language model, or if you want to call from the OpenAI API using your API key. So this is going to be very helpful for those who want to build their own websites where they can collect information and have a better understanding of collecting data through the question and answers through the ChatGPT. So let's get started. So we set up the project using Poetry. Poetry New will generate an environment where I can work on my project, and within my project I need to add a number of dependencies such as Streamlit, LLMChain, OpenAI, and the python.envs. So it's gonna take a while to set up, and then we add an app directory where I'm storing all the Streamlit required files. So within that main file, I need to have one function where I have different components. First, let's give it a test and run the application to see if it's working. And by running that, it takes a bit of time, but it now looks like it's working. So we run the Poetry install and then install our package. So once we have that, it's very important because we need that underline init.py to be effective. And then we start setting up the sidebar component as well as the chat message component. So for the sidebar component, we have the message history files. So we need to call all the files for the messages, and also we need to pass the save chat button, and we need to loop through all the message history files ending with the underlying message.json and pass it as a button on the sidebar. So for those buttons, I pass a load chat history function, but since I don't have that yet, so I'll pass that in the if condition. Then I also have the save chat button. For that, whenever it is clicked, I want to look under the session state messages. So if it's non-zero, or the length of that is non-zero, and save that in the chat history, and then clear up the session state messages. So that's for the save chat. Looking at, we need to have an image. So the image is similar to what you see on the OpenAI of the how can I help you today. So we add the static directory. Within that, we passed some static files, and then within these the app, I sectionalize columns, and then for the fourth column, I add the image. And then I pass the markdown. So within the markdown, I have the capability to pass HTML tags, but remember that you cannot pass the image tags, or where you can pass a source. That gives you an error or it doesn't show up. So for peering the messages within the environment, we need to pass the chat message and containing a row. The user input is pointed to the chat input, which has a placeholder message ChatGPT. And then whenever there is an input from the user, we'll save that in our list of dictionaries or list of contents. And so we pass the user as a chat message, and then mark it down on the user input. And then we have the chat message for the AI, where we have a spinner. So a spinner is running until we get the chat completion response from the large language model. We need to have a mechanism to pass the stdout, streaming it onto the Streamlit application. And in order to do that, we generate or create a utils function using the context manager, and we pass the context manager as a decorator to this function, which we call it the stdout streaming, and then we have the input to this function, the output func, and we use the string IO object with which usually is used to store the values that comes from stdout. So we write that into a variable, then keep that variable and pass the information through an internal function into another variable, and we'll get the output results like that, and then yield the values of the stdout right to wherever we want. So for example, here we're passing the information or streaming the information to the output environment in the Streamlit. So we need to also port the util function that we just created there, and we pass the info method of that output. So since we don't have the LLM function or the LLM capability, we just comment it here, and we just put the response. So now we need to set up the large language model library. So here we have the get-LLMChain. So within get-LLMChain, we need to load the environment variables. So we store that under the .env, and we set up the large language model object for OpenAI API, as well as for local LLMs. So we need to also set up the LangChain or the LLMChain using LangChain, and also create the large language model object. So first we start for the OpenAI object. We pass the callback manager. We default it to none. We use the chat OpenAI from the LangChain library. We also make sure that we've set the temperature to 0 to avoid model's creativity, so to speak. We set up another object for local LLMs. We need two variables here. One is the name of the large language model, and the other one is the callback manager, similar to the OpenAI. We store local models under the models, so make sure that you do not pass models to your Git. So to import the large language models, we using the llama C++. So it is shown to be very effective to use quantized models. So we're using quantized models because I have limited capacity of CPU and memory here. And then I'll set up the large language model chain using the LLMChain from LangChain. I pass two variables, the LLM and the prompt. The prompt is, I'm using one prompt for chat and one prompt for summary. And there are some tags and run names for Langsmith, and I've actually have another video on Langsmith that I have put in the description, so you can follow that if you're interested in learning more about Langsmith. For the chat LLMChain, I pass the LLM option, so it can be in OpenAI or the local LLM. I'm setting up the prompt, so I have the system message and the human message. So I'm using some template for my prompt, and then instantiate the chat prompt template and pass it as a chat prompt. So next thing I need to set up the summary chain, and I use the summary chain to generate a particular a meaningful topic actually for the messages to be saved, to be stored. So I create this chat topic. I need to have this get summary chain object and invoke a summary of the messages dictionary that are passed in. So I will create, for now, I will create a similar chain to get chat LLMChain. Similar to that, I'll pass the same thing and then return the LLMChain. So now that I have that function there, so I'll import that from the corresponding library. So right now it's called get summary LLMChain. So it's now there. Now I need to define another function or another util function. So the best place for that is within the Streamlit utils. So I put the function that stringifies the chat messages within the dictionary. So I call it the stringify message content, and the input is a messages dictionary. And so these are some typing annotations that are really helpful for developing your code and enhancing the quality of your code. And so I want to store all the messages in a long string that has this sort of shape where it starts with a role and then a semicolon and then content and so on. So once I have this, I will return that and use that to invoke it through the summary chain. So the summary chain is actually returning 5 important words out of this whole message content to get the user's intent for that messages. So once I pass that, then I'll use the JSON library to essentially dump all the chat topic result and save it within my project directory. So let's run this, and we can see that we have the save chat button there, the chat input, and some of the UIs looking good. Now let's see what else do we need. So we still need to actualize the LLM call for the chat. So we have the get chat LLMChain here. We instantiate that. We pass as a default, we pass the OpenAI for now, and then later on, once we have the local LLMs, we pass the LLMChain, the local LLM as well. So now we can give it a try to see if it's working. We still need to set up the OpenAI API key, so we have that .env there. So we need to first onset the OpenAI API key, and yeah, it's now working. So the next thing that I need to put is the local LLMs. For that, for the UI, I will be using the select box, and I am passing a list of large language models. So in order to find out what local models I have, I am looping through all the files within the models directory. So I'm using the OS list directory method and pass it over to the list here. I'm actually looking for files that ends with the GGUF, which is the quantized version of the large language models, or the quantized version of the binary that is readable by C++. So for now, I just downloaded the stable language model from Zephyr, which is 1.6 billion, and it's quantized version of 8. And I'm just doing some operation changes, and as you can see, L1 option is over there and it's looking fine. So let's just pass a prompt, and yeah, we need to install the llama C++ Python as well. So that's installed, and now let's rerun it, passing the same prompt, and yeah, get the response. And it's actually streaming beautifully on the output. And here are some summary results from the large language model. So the local LLM works fine. Now, other thing that we missed is loading a message. So saving of the message looks fine and worked. Now loading a message, so we're loading from the file and using the JSON load the messages and return that in as a dictionary. So we have the function, so we can uncomment that and also uncomment save chat history. We also need to import that because I already that save chat history. So everything looks good right now. We have the initialized messages. We have the callbacks for the save chat button. Now let's run this. Default is the local LLMs. Let's just pass a generic prompt. So yeah, it's streaming beautifully. Let's ask one more time, maybe another prompt. So looks like it's working fine, and the save chat works, and also you can see that I have the list for the loading messages. Yeah, so select option works right now. So everything looks like it's working pretty good, and the change works. So the next thing I want to talk about is .streamlit. So if you look under the .streamlit, when you install a Streamlit, you can actually add a config.toml file where you can add a tag for theme, within which you can change primary color, background color, or any CSS styles that you can think of. So it's very, very helpful. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to hit that subscribe and like button. I'm looking forward to seeing you in my next video. Until then,